Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar entitled A Clear-Eyed View of Coal. Today we'll be having two IEEFA analysts discuss the current state of coal in the United States. IEEFA, or the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, is a global think tank that examines issues related to energy markets, trends, and policies. Our mission is to accelerate the transition to a diverse, sustainable, and profitable energy economy. Today's presenters are Seth Feaster and Dennis Wamsted. Seth is an energy data analyst whose work focuses on the coal industry and the US power sector. Before joining IEEFA, he created visual presentations at the New York Times for 25 years with a focus on complex financial and energy data. He has also worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Dennis focuses on the ongoing transition away from fossil fuels to green generation resources, focusing particularly on the electric power sector. He has 30 years of experience tracking utility transitions and technology developments, beginning with a long stint as the executive editor of the Energy Daily, a leading trade publication based in Washington, D.C. He has consulted for numerous utilities and industry organizations, focusing on the technology and policy trends reshaping the power sector. Seth and Dennis will present for about a half hour about why restarting coal plants doesn't make economic sense and why coal plant closures are likely to continue. After the presentation, we'll be taking questions for the rest of the hour using our Q&A function. The chat function is off, so if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature. If we don't get to all the questions, we will do our best to follow up with you offline. This webinar is being recorded and the slides and video will be made available following today's webinar. We'll now hand it over to Seth to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks very much. If we can go to the first slide. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to talk about U.S. coal, mostly U.S. coal in the power sector today. And we will break this presentation down into three parts. But I do want to go over a couple of things first about terminology. You may see a lot of different reports out there that mix the use of plants and units, power plants and power units, as same kind of thing. They are not. Power plants often have multiple independently operable units for generating power. We study the power sector at the unit level because a power plant may have different fuels at different units. And some of those units may be closed and some of them may not be closed. And so really the primary level at which we study the power sector, and particularly the coal industry in coal use in the power sector, is the unit. Next slide, please. I also want to talk a little bit about the way we use the terms retirements, closures, conversions, and what we mean when we talk about the end of coal use. Retired is kind of an official terminology used in the industry when a unit has stopped generating power, but also usually has been officially deactivated from the grid, or it has really long-term unavailability to the grid. And sometimes, but pretty rarely, that includes units that have been mothballed, quote unquote, mothballed, or in cold shutdown. That means that those units cannot be easily restarted by the owner. They can't necessarily just jump back on and produce power without going through a considerable process, both with the grid operator and the owner of the plant in order to make it viable to produce power again. This is very different than operating units that are sometimes in short-term outages, which could be as much as a year sometimes, in the case of problems at the plant, problems at the unit. But we look at operating units and include them as operating whether or not they're in short-term outages. Now, when it comes to the end of coal use and conversions, we only consider units that are being converted to 100% gas as having permanently ended coal use. There are some units in the country that use a mix of coal and gas. We still consider them as operating with coal. they're not using as much coal, but they're still operating using some coal. We also, upon occasion, are aware that units that are being converted to gas stop burning coal and start the conversion process. Even if they're not finished with that conversion process, they've actually stopped using coal. And there are a number of units in the country that are currently in that status. So next slide, please. We'll start our first of the three sections by taking a look at the past. And there's been some discussion that coal plants that were recently closed, coal units that were recently closed, could be restarted and will lead to a revival in coal use. We don't think that's the case, and we're going to go through why that's the case now. Next slide, please. So we did an analysis of the 102 coal-fired units that were 50 megawatts or more. That's usually a threshold. It's kind of a convenient threshold that marks the difference between sort of local, very small academic or municipal power plants. There's quite a few of those, but they really don't add up to much capacity. The ones that are larger than 50 megawatts are really the ones that provide all the power in the country. So we looked at the 102 units that were closed between the beginning of 2021 and the beginning of this year. That they had a total capacity of a little over 36.5 gigawatts. And we looked at those partly because they really seemed like they would have the most viability for restart. Since they're the most recently closed. You get older than that and they haven't been used, you still really start to have problems with the turbines and with all the equipment in getting them restarted. And we'll talk a little bit more about the costs involved in potentially restarting any of those units. But first, next slide, please. We're going to go through why it's pretty impossible to restart most, if not all, of these units. So this is a look at the 102 units by the year that they closed, and the size of these gray circles represents their capacity when they were closed. So they range in size here from little under 100 megawatts, really a little over 50 megawatts, all the way up to the largest one, which was around 1,300 megawatts. There was one unit like that. Next slide, please. So we then took a look at, well, which of these units has already been converted to a different fuel? And there were 14 units like that. Most of them, with one exception, were converted to gas. The one exception is a unit that is in a reliability must-run condition in Maryland, and it actually runs on fuel oil, but that's a little misleading because it's probably not going to be run very much at all. But that takes out 14 of these 102 units. Next slide, please. Then we looked at, well, some of these units have actually been demolished already. And that's at least 24 of these units, and others of them are slated to be demolished. But these 24 units in particular have either been smokestacks torn down, like at San Juan, the picture you saw at the beginning of the presentation in our opening slide, and it ranges all across the country. Most of them are being torn down and scrapped. They've been replaced already with other units, often gas-fired units or solar and battery storage. But that's another 24 units. Next slide, please. And then finally, we took a look at, out of these 102 units, well, age is really a problem. And the older these units get, the more difficult it is to keep them in operable condition. The costs of maintenance and operation go way up. So we took a look at, well, how many of these units were or are 55 or more years older? That means they came online in 1970 or earlier, and some of these units date back certainly to the 1960s and a few to the 1950s. These are not units that are likely to be economic or necessarily even viable to restart because they are so old. And that took out as many as the conversions in the demolished units. That's another 38 units out of these 102. So what does that leave us with? Next slide, please. Well, that left us with 26 remaining units, or about 25% of these 102 units. And of these, I will say that there are some that are under legal agreements to not run. The Rush Island facility is in here. There are some that are pretty old too. There may not be from 1970 or earlier, but they're from the 70s. And so a lot of these are not really very viable for restart either. And I want to point out that some of the newest ones that were closed, like the one in 2025, um, which is the Indian River, they wanted to close that plant a number of years ago, but it was also in a reliability must run situation. And the company that owns it really doesn't have any interest in restarting it because it wasn't economic to run in the first place. Next slide, please. So in summary, this is really a list. Looking at these 102 units really made us realize just how impossible it is to go back and restart units that have already been closed. Not least because these closures are nearly all part of long-term plans by states, by utilities, extensively negotiating what their power generation portfolio is going to be that they work out with state regulators and state regulators approve. They have made tremendous investments into the billions and billions of dollars for replacement resources. So it's unlikely that you would be restarting a coal plant if you have a brand new and far more efficient gas plant next door that you've already sunk a tremendous amount of money in, and you would not run it instead of your coal plant. That's not likely to happen. There are plenty of examples around the country like this. Beyond that, closures, as I already mentioned, were almost always uneconomic. We believe that in every case, utilities chose units that were the poorest, or certainly among the poorest performing of their generation assets. And they were already little used when they were in the years before they were closed. Further, in addition to having new plants already built or in the process of being built, the land that these coal plants sit on, as well as their infrastructure, their electrical infrastructure, and the transmission rights, have already been committed to either new generation or other purposes. And so restarting a coal plant that was closed may run into some real headwinds here because the ability to get power out or the ability to use the infrastructure has already been compromised. In addition to that, as utilities and other power producers look to close these units, they are not spending any money that they don't have to on maintenance. And so by the time these units are shut down, they often have a pretty serious backlog of maintenance that would cost a lot of money. And once these units have been sitting there for a while, and haven't really been maintained, it's very difficult to restart them because of damage that may be done to things like warped turbines, shafts, and other kinds of maintenance issues that really get exacerbated the longer they sit there without being used. Very, very challenging, very expensive to restart. And as I already mentioned, the age of these 102 units, median age was 56 at the time they closed. That's really well past their prime performance. Next slide, please. So we then get into another issue with these older plants. If they were going to be restarted, somebody has to pay for them. There was the case of the Pleasants plant in West Virginia that was going to be closed. The state tried to push a couple of First Energy subsidiaries in order to buy the plant. And they said for that plant, it would cost them $3 million a month just to keep it in sort of this warm status in order to be able to be restarted. But they wouldn't use it for nearly a year. And that $3 million a month would have had to been paid for by somebody. That somebody is ratepayers, and ratepayers in West Virginia were not happy about paying for a power plant that they weren't going to get any power from and having their electric bills go up just to study this. In the case of independent power producers, that would impact investors if you were to try and keep those plants around. Unlikely that investors who've already made the decision in order to close certain units are going to be willing to shell out a bunch of money in order to keep those units around. And the argument has been made that, well, we'll just generate power and that's how we'll pay for keeping these units back. The units were already used very little. They were uneconomic. In other words, they couldn't sell power economically in the marketplaces that they were in. And that means that your losses from keeping the plant around while you're not able to make money from selling power would be pretty significant. And that would either impact, again, ratepayers or investors. Next slide, please. So that's a look quickly at the recent past, the last 4 years of units that have already closed. Now let's take a look at, well, what's going to happen with the units that are either closing this year or next year or on into the future. Because once again, next slide, please, we're talking about units that have had this long-term planning process between the utilities and state regulators in order to either replace the capacity or make make decisions about what their grid system was going to need into the future. So this year, there are currently scheduled 23 units at 15 different power plants that are scheduled in coal use. That includes a number of units that are being converted to gas. I believe that 2 of those in Wyoming are still awaiting state approval for the gas conversion. It was last time I checked. But then there are others, and these are being or were being fought in some places, but it's unlikely that these closures will be rolled back because of both the cost and the long-term planning process that already went into the effort of choosing these and getting replacement resources. Next slide, please. I've kind of gone through a bunch of these things. You still have you have the long-term plans, as I mentioned. You have these huge investments in replacement resources. You have the poor performance of the assets that are being closed. And you have the question of cost, which is completely wide open and unresolved. And you would have to sort that out between state regulators and the utilities and the investors about who's going to pay for this. And there would probably be some considerable process of, unless the federal government steps in and offers a lot of subsidies in order to keep these plants open and pay for it. But that kind of defies the whole purpose of having a marketplace for power, because then that means the federal government would be putting its thumb on the scale for coal in ways that it is not for other kinds of fuels, including gas. So there would be a considerable pushback from all directions if coal plants were to be further subsidized in order to keep them open. In addition to that, you would have protests from states that have, or utilities that have already made plans for coal phase outs. And that includes places like Washington State, where the Centralia plant is supposed to be closed this year. And they have state policy about getting out of coal. That's the last coal-fired unit in the state. There are others like it. And so that would probably generate a lot of legal and public opposition as well. Next slide, please. We also have quotes in this particular case, the CEO of Excel talking about this very thing that we've mentioned. And this is a good description. They are an example of a company that has been very much involved in the planning, the long-term planning of their resources with state commissions and other stakeholders, including the towns and cities where these plants are located, and get tax revenue from it. And they are working hard in order to work with those stakeholders and build new resources in order to replace those resources, many of which are very old and have to be replaced at some point anyway. And so Mr. Frenzel here is talking about how they are able to retire these inefficient and aging coal plants while making sure that they keep a high level of reliability and their customer bills low. That's their mandate from the state. You have to provide reliable electric power, and you have to try and keep customer bills low. And so they are doing this, making these decisions to the best of their ability, based on the information they have, their economic information. And so this is really further confirmation that a lot of these closures that are planned for 2025 and 2026 are unlikely to be stopped. Next slide, please. So I kind of want to go through what's pretty interesting about where we are today in terms of coal generation capacity in the United States. I'm going to take us back to 2011, which was the year in which the US had its peak capacity from coal at 317 plus gigawatts. That's a fair amount. At that time, coal was still providing probably around 50% of all the power generated in the United States. Just for comparison, this year, coal is probably going to provide 15% of all the power in the United States. So we've gone from 50 to 15% in the last 15 years. Next slide, please. So, no, let's go back one quickly. There we go. So between 2011 and 2020, there was about a third of that capacity was closed. Now, capacity is a measure of how much the plants could provide, how much power they could provide. It is not a measure of how much power they are providing, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But about a third was closed in this first decade since the peak. Next slide. Then between 2021 and now, which is really the period that we were talking about with the 102 units, we closed around another 45 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity, according to EIA. Next slide. By the end of this decade, it is expected that we'll have closed 103 more gigawatts of power, which will take us to about 2/3 of all that coal-fired power capacity will be closed by 2030. Next year, we expect to hit the halfway point of closures, right? We're getting very close to that right now. We're in the upper 40% mark. And so with the planned closures, we should be hitting the 50% closure mark of capacity in 2026. We still believe that's going to be the case. But that's not all of the closures that have been planned. Next slide, please. There have already been announcements from the plant owners about what they're going to close between 2031 and 2040, and some of them even further out than that. And part of this is simply age. Part of it is replacement resources that need to be built. And so you're now getting up into an even higher percentage, getting close to 80% of all the coal-fired capacity has already either been closed or been planned. There's been plans set in place to close it and replacement power provided. There is still some 64 gigawatts or so that there have not been closure announcements. But I would point out that those plants are all largely getting much older too. And by the time you get to 2040, they will be another 15 years older than they are right now. And so the likelihood of those staying open, the vast majority of them staying open for much longer than 2040 is very low. So next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Dennis, following that look at the past and look at kind of where we are now. And he's going to talk about the market challenges and this issue of age and how that poses problems going forward.
Thank you very much, Seth. That was a fabulous introduction to where we are. And now I'm going to try to take us a little bit into the future, starting from today and then looking out a few years into what we see developing as the U.S. electricity sector transitions into the future. Next slide, please. We're going to focus on a couple things and try to do this quickly so we do have time for Q&A at the end. But I am particularly interested and follow closely the growth of solar and dispatchable battery storage in the United States. Those two things, coupled with continued wind and new gas, pose a huge threat, a continuing threat to coal going forward. We do not at IEEFA see that trend that Seth outlined in his charts coming to any type of plateau. We see it continuing down the path toward complete retirement. And as he mentioned, the first key milestone should be next year when we get to that 50% mark. It is quite a phenomenal milestone, if you will, to think about having retired or replaced 160,000 megawatts of coal-fired capacity in 15 years. If you had said that in 2011, people would have looked at you funny. But next slide, please. So this is something we have written about at IEEFA and something I want to dwell on a little bit here. This is an extraordinary chart because of the widespread nature of the solar records that have been set in the United States this spring. If you haven't seen this chart, we've done two things here. The new records are listed underneath the organized markets. So if you look to the left in CAISO, that's 20,818 megawatts of peak capacity for solar on the day the record was set. And then the yellow circles, conveniently enough, show you what their market share was at the time of the record being set. So in CAISO on that day in April, solar, and this is just utility scale solar, was providing 76% of all market demand in the market in California. CAISO supplies about 80% of the market in all of California. But we know, and most of you, I'm sure, know that Texas, ERCOT, Texas, and CAISO and California have been the market leaders for a long time in utility scale solar. But what's really informative about this chart is there was a record set in April in every one of the 7 organized markets in the United States. And obviously they're at different levels and different percentages, but it shows the spread of solar across the country and it shows the growth. And that growth is, interestingly enough, already out of date. I posted something on LinkedIn last week about how a new record was set in CAISO, and I actually forget the number offhand, but I could certainly get it for anybody who's really interested. And a new record was set in the PJM market late last week or the week before. So it is hard to keep track of the records as they fall, and they will continue to fall. The reason they'll continue to fall is because EIA is categorizing or taking, projecting the new installations going forward. They just released their last short-term energy outlook yesterday, and they're projecting that 60,000 megawatts of new solar capacity will be added this year and next year. It is essentially a straight translation to the addition of new capacity and new market share for solar across the country and new solar records being set. Their projection, if all of that capacity does come online, and I expect most of it will because a huge percentage of it's already under construction, but they are now saying that by the end of 2026, solar will be providing 8% of the total U.S. generation for electricity, nationwide. And this is a market that really didn't start growing until, well, it was in 2026, it'll be effectively 10 years since the real surge in solar generation started. So you go from nothing or less than 1% to more than 8% in 10 years. So we have well, we have no doubt that that's going to happen in the short term. Longer term, there are certainly some uncertainties going on, but circling back to what Seth brought up about the retirement of a lot of these coal plants through the end of 2030, most of that is in territories run by, state regulated utilities, most of whom have long-term plans for the closure of those facilities and are building now the capacity to replace the coal plants that are being closed. Some of that will be gas, some of that will be wind, a lot of it will be solar, and a lot of it will be dispatchable battery storage. So we're not going to predict the exact number of solar megawatts to come online through 2030, but we don't see the transition toward solar and wind and battery storage slowing down much over the next 5 years. There's a lot of built-in momentum. Next slide, please. And this is another way of looking at that built-in momentum. So solar is one side of this coin. The other side, in our view, is battery storage, which makes a lot of things possible for renewable energy. And I just want you to focus here on the far right of this chart, where you can see that we essentially we passed 20,000 megawatts in 2024 of installed battery capacity. It was maybe 25,000 megawatts by the end of last year. It's going to more than double in 2 years. And that also is stuff that is mostly already under construction. EIA, in its latest outlook, is now saying that we will have in the US 60,000 megawatts of installed battery storage by the end of 2026. Most of that, not all of that, will be a 4-hour duration storage, which makes a lot of things possible. Next slide, please. What it makes possible is the ability to soak up solar, and this has become evident over and over again in California in particular this year and last year, where they now have about 10,000 megawatts of installed, well, actually more than that, about 11,000 megawatts of installed battery storage capacity in California. And during the day, batteries are often contributing to load in the state of 5, 6, 7,000 megawatts. So the solar that last year or in years past would have been curtailed or wasted is now being used to fill up batteries during the day. And those batteries in turn are being used in the evening to effectively time shift solar power. And it is very common now in California for battery storage to be the largest resource on the grid in a 2, 3, 4-hour period in the evening. Almost all of that battery storage can be traced directly to solar power. So you are using solar during the day to power the grid, and you are using solar in the early evening to power the grid, and significantly cutting down on the amount of, in California, on the amount of gas that is required to run the grid. This is also starting to become very clear in Texas, with Texas, different market, different set of parameters there. Most of the batteries there are 2 hours in length, but still the batteries in Texas are doing very similar things, helping to shift effectively or allow renewables, wind and solar in Texas, to be used in the evenings and the early mornings before the sun comes up and starts producing again. Next slide, please. And this is actually an Australian example, but it's one of the better ones I've found that actually shows, for people not familiar with the intricacies of of how the grid works. But this is a smaller facility in Australia that came online earlier this year and is under contract to provide 4 hours of battery storage power in the evening. And so on the left of each of these 3 days here, you can see the solar facility during the day going up and down and not sending as much power to the grid, because what the facility is doing is charging its 4 hours worth of batteries. And so each evening in this 3 day period, you can see the solar is providing firm dispatchable solar power between 5:30 and 9:30 at night on the Australian national market. That is well, evening to nighttime period, and that was the parameters of the contract. But it shows very clearly that solar is and can be a dispatchable resource. And we need to think about renewables a little bit differently than you might hear from some other folks out there in the conversation. Next slide, please. One of the things I want to go back to is the thing that we talked about earlier was capacity, and Seth spent a long time on capacity, which has declined. As you can see here, the light blue line at the top here is declined by almost 46 or a little over 45%. We expected to hit 50% by next year. But what is informative and important for you to realize is the discrepancy between the decline in capacity and the amount of generation that has been coming from coal over the past, well, actually, essentially since the decline started. But generation has gone down by 62%. This is a real clear indicator of the uneconomic nature of coal generation in the United States. If coal was still a relatively economic competitor, those two lines would be very, very close together. Maybe a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but generation would not have declined by 62% with capacity only declining by 45%. And just as a quick reminder for those who don't follow this day in and day out, capacity factor is the amount of power you produce measured over a given period of time compared to what you could produce if you produced 100% of the time. For large units like coal plants and nuclear power plants, capacity factor is a very good proxy for economic competitiveness. Obviously, if you're talking about a gas-fired peaker plant that's only supposed to run, 2-3 hours every couple of days, capacity factor doesn't mean anything. But for a large plant, a large coal plant or a large nuclear plant, if their capacity factors aren't high, that means they're having trouble competing in the market. We don't see this changing going forward. Coal plants are getting increasingly uneconomic. And so these two lines, we expect to continue their fall, and they may actually continue to diverge. There has been an interesting problem over the past couple of years. Actually, next slide, please. With even the largest plants in the United States, and I've listed 6 of them here, and they're spread all over the country, but even these plants that you would think might be the best and the biggest, the best run, they've had capacity factors falling significantly. And last year, all of them had capacity factors below 40%, which is not a good number if you are a large coal-fired power plant. Next slide, please. Okay, this is totally off target, but I figured it would come up in the questions and answers here. And I wanted to spend 2 minutes talking about the blackout in Spain a couple weeks ago. And just to put out there the fact that in any early analysis here, we still don't know what happened. We, not just IEEFA, but we, the grid operators in Spain, and we, the journalists here in the US and elsewhere around the world. There has been a lot of early finger pointing about renewables being the blame because they don't have something called inertia. And I would caution everyone who is thinking about doing stories about this going forward that there's a lot more to it than just that. And there are ways to plan for a grid that has less inertia than previous grids. So the lack of inertia will be a characteristic, perhaps, of grids that are high in renewables, but that does not mean they're a disqualifying characteristic. It means it's something that can be planned for. There are grid forming inverters in existence now that work quite well in actually mimicking what we call inertia from spinning machines in the fossil fuel genre. So I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this. I will be happy to answer questions or follow up emails, but I did want to point out that the lack of coal, the lack of inertia that is signified by retiring coal-fired power plants, it is not by itself or in and of itself a reason for this transition not to continue. We are planning for a different kind of grid right now, and it will be operated differently. That doesn't mean it won't be just as reliable and just as capable of supplying electricity when you want the lights to go on. Next slide, please. And so with that, I will conclude, and hopefully we have time for Q&A here. And just to point out, we've gone full circle. The demolished plant on the first slide was in the background here. You can see the 4 smokestacks before they were demolished at San Juan. But in the foreground, we have a bunch of solar that's now being built to replace that plant. And way in the background, on the left of the slide, is the Four Corners plant in the neighboring Four Corners plant, which is also on Seth's list for retirement in 2031. So we will be doing an update for sure on this in 2031 when we have the demolition video for Four Corners. But with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jamie, and we can move into questions and answers.
Great. Thank you guys so much for your presentation. We have about 13 minutes left until the hour. We have 7 questions. I will read them in the order they came in. Our first one, to the point about coal retirement being extensively negotiated with regulators and stakeholders, do you think the generation fast-track proposals being developed by the RTOs, ISOs, such as RRI and PJM, ERAS, and MISO, and SPP, would make new fast-track gen a better alternative than restarting a resource?
I'll take a first go at that, and then Seth can add things if he wants to going forward. I actually don't think either one of those are a good option for the capacity that we need. A lot of these skip the line proposals in PJM, MISO, and SPP are favored toward gas, and there isn't the ability to build gas in the near term because turbines have already been sold, and the necessary infrastructure that would be needed to get the gas to where the turbines were going to be built may not be in place. So this fast skip the line proposal might not actually get anybody online by 2030, which is the goal of most of the proposals. And I think, as you can tell, we think restarting coal plants is a non-starter, if you will. So I am a big fan of the folks at NextEra Energy, one of the largest renewable developers in the United States, but also a very large gas utility. And they say over and over again that what we need to build now and what we need to build as fast as we can is renewables. Batteries, wind, solar are there, can be brought online in 18 to 24 months, and they're the lowest cost alternative right now. And that's what we need to build. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Seth.
Yeah, I just want to add one quick thing to Dennis's points, which is that this notion of fast tracking projects, the vast majority of what is in most of these grid areas queues is solar and storage at this point. There are a few gas plants around the country that are either underway or planned. It would be probably pretty tough in order to speed up some of those projects. They do take time to build, but the queues are filled with solar and storage. So fast tracking usually means building that stuff faster in order to provide those resources.
Great, thank you. Our next question, if the US administration is pushing to keep coal plants operating, is there any scope for federal monies to be directed to subsidize this, regardless of how inefficient that is fiscally?
Well, we try to stay far, far away from the federal budget debates because you could ask me today and it would be one answer, and in 2 months it would be a totally different answer. I don't know if there's federal money available to do this or not. But if there is, that just means that taxpayers are subsidizing uneconomic resources. So those ratepayers in Wyoming, if they were to keep a plant open in Wyoming that was slated to convert, would be subsidizing it with their higher rates in Wyoming and also through their tax dollars that were going to the IRS. So to me, it doesn't make sense either way you look at it. Whether the administration could come up with those dollars, I have no idea. Seth?
Yeah, I just want to mention the case of West Virginia here, where the state, either through the recommendation of the legislature and the pressure from the public service board there, tried to encourage the coal plants there to burn more coal, except that when they lost money burning that coal and wanted to get the money that they spent on coal back from ratepayers, there suddenly was an uproar from ratepayers about paying for all that extra coal-fired power. So it could be very challenging. This is why this question of who's going to pay for this becomes really important. Ratepayers don't like to see their electric bills go up, ever. And last I checked, there was a lot of debate in Washington about how to lower federal spending, not raise federal spending. So, I certainly am not going to get into the business of predicting how federal policy is going to turn out over the next few months, but I think it's going to be a challenging environment fiscally in order to come up with the kind of money that would meaningfully help the coal industry in any way, shape, or form. And I really question whether or not any of that money will be there, because you have forget the renewables industry, you will have a lot of pushback from the rest of the fossil fuel industry, namely the gas industry, which is coal's main competitor in many places, about helping coal versus helping gas. So I'll just put that out there.
Thank you. Next question. Can you talk a little bit about how you compiled this data on closures, retirements, demolitions, conversions, etc.?
That's
Sure.
all you, Seth.
It's my life. So we start, you're going to find a big discrepancy, I think, between some of the lists that EIA keeps about what retirements are happening in the future and the list that we keep, because we spend a lot of our days reading integrated resource plans, or IRPs, company announcements, company financials, whether it's in their annual reports or quarterly reports, and trying to keep track of what the companies themselves are saying about retirements and closures, right? And so it's a really moving target all the time, but we believe that we've compiled a very extensive and comprehensive list of where most of these projects stand. And we have a pretty high degree of confidence in our numbers, because we're constantly checking what the status is between the utilities, but also on the local level, right? Like I am checking in Wyoming about whether or not the Public Service Commission is going to approve the gas conversion of these two units or not. In Michigan, there's a plant this year that's slated to close, Campbell, that the county, Ottawa County, I believe, was thinking about taking legal action to try and force the plant to be kept open. The county board has declined recently in one of their meetings in order to pursue that legal action. So we've got a pretty close eye on, not just the status of these things about, some report from 3 years ago, but about what's happening currently in multiple ways about the real status of these closures or conversions.
Thank you, Seth. Next question. How do the reasons for continued retirement change in a load growth environment where peak power might fetch a very high price, or where regulators feel they need replacement resources plus coal to maintain reliability and costs can be justified on reliability or even RMR orders?
Like 5 questions in one, in that one question. That's great. I love that.
Do you want me to repeat?
No. I actually pulled it up and I can actually see them here. But
Okay.
so uh, there's a point that we stress all the time at IEEFA, and that is some of these you'll hear a lot from maybe this administration, and you will hear in the media that, oh, well, this plant has delayed its retirement. And that is true. Some plants have delayed their retirement. That doesn't mean they're going to operate. And it certainly doesn't mean they're going to operate any more than they currently are. So you get a plant that we would like to have retired in 2025. And they may say, well, we have to keep operating until 2026. That means they'll be online. That doesn't mean they'll be generating at 100% capacity factor. They may be generating at 5% capacity factor. They may be around for one day in the wintertime. So it's important to keep that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about this retirement debate. They are being retired, and I would like them all to be retired in 2025. But if it gets pushed out to 2026 because PJM says that they have to have that plant continue to operate while they build some new transmission to make sure the grid as a whole is safe and reliable, okay, that's fine. So that plant will remain online, probably providing what we call voltage support, but not actually producing power of any significant amount and sending it into the grid. The fact that you've delayed your retirement doesn't mean you're already all of a sudden an economic resource ready to be used. And there was another part of that question about load growth. Coal plants play very little role in the peak power debate. That is not a coal plant thing. Coal plants tend to run consistently and ramp up as little and ramp down as little as possible. They're not a peak resource for 7 p.m. in the evening in Texas. That's going to be supplied by batteries and gas-fired facilities. And I don't know if you want to chime in there, Seth, too, but.
Yeah, I do. I think I want to address more directly some of the financial incentives and the political realities that utilities and power producers face. So, look, utilities are not immune to political pressure. They are state-regulated entities for the most part. And they're also profit-making capitalist ventures. So utilities have this mandate to provide reliable power and keep it at a low cost for ratepayers. So, but they're also making money by keeping some of these coal plants around. And so the idea that because they're in what's called rate base, and ratepayers are still paying the maintenance costs of keeping those plants around. So as utilities, they're often faced with this dilemma. Do we close a plant and run afoul of either political pressure or run afoul of the possibility of not having enough power at some point in the summer or winter and really get into trouble with reliability? They don't really want to risk that either. They're very risk averse. So, like Dennis said, what you end up with is a situation where you may not retire the plant officially, but it does not mean it's going to get used very much at all and burn very much coal. This is not keeping plants from retiring does not mean saving the coal industry, the coal mining industry at all. It's really a way of utilities protecting themselves at relatively low cost, right? Both politically and financially, since ratepayers are footing the bill. So I think that it can be misplaced sometimes, the focus on retirements, with one exception. When we're talking about coal mining, retired coal plants are gone. Those are customers that are essentially lost forever to the coal mining industry. And so when people talk about any potential revival in coal mining and coal use, very soon we're going to be talking about half of the potential customer base that was around in 2011 is gone. That really limits any future potential of growing coal sales and coal use in the United States. It really limits it if you've closed half the facilities. So that's a slightly different aspect than what we're talking about here. But it's a really important one when talking about whether or not you're going to see a revival of coal mining in the country.
Thank you. We are at the top of the hour. So if we were not able to get to your questions, Seth and Dennis's contact information will go out with the slides after this webinar. Any final thoughts, Dennis or Seth, before we sign off?
Final thoughts being that the transition is taking place now, and we think it may slow down. We admit it may slow down a little bit in the next few years, but we do not think that there's anything that's going to stop this transition.
Thank you. Seth?
Yeah, I'll just add to what Dennis said there is that the more we look at the rate of retirements and the usage of coal plants, as well as what's in the queue, the speed of the solar build out, the speed of battery storage being built, and how it's really transforming the grid, we have a very difficult time seeing how this trend, with all its momentum everywhere in the country, is going to be slowed down in any meaningful way. I think that would be very challenging to do that, even with all the heft and financial ability of the federal government. It's tough to see how states and utilities are going to roll back this many years of planning. And so, like Dennis said, we just see that this transition is going to continue to roll along and kind of be amazed. We're constantly amazed at how it has picked up the pace, particularly in solar and storage, in recent years. And so we're not seeing any change in trajectory for the transition right now.
Thank you. And thank all of you who have attended our webinar. Keep an eye out for an email with the slides and Dennis and Seth's contact information for further questions. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.